Guys, in this complete Java course, I will teach you constructors from starting to end. We will see every small details associated with the constructors, and most important, I am going to cover all possible interview questions by the end of this video. So you can expect to become a pro in constructors and can answer literally everything your interviewer asks for it. So without wasting any time, let's begin. So what is a constructor? A constructor is basically just a method that is used to initialize an object. Okay. And they are called automatically when an object is created using new. Okay. They do not have a return type and it has the same name as the class. Alright. So this, if this sound overwhelming, don't worry, just hold on for a minute and you will understand everything, literally everything. So before deep diving, let us just talk about a very simple syntax which you all might have come across to it. Okay, so the statement says vehicle. If I have a class called as vehicle and I create an object of this vehicle, so vehicle obj is equal to new vehicle. You must have seen this type of statement before. Okay, let's try to understand this statement in a little better way. All right, so that we can understand constructor better. Let me change the color. Okay, so first of all, let's just focus on this particular part. When we say new vehicle, okay, or expect, just leave new for now, just talk about vehicle. Okay, so when we are doing this, we are basically calling a function. If you have seen this, this is a parenthesis. And what does parenthesis means? Parenthesis means this is a function. So this vehicle is basically nothing else but just a simple function. All right, okay, so this function will have a return type and it returns something, and whatever this function is returning, where we are storing that data, we are storing that data in this obj object. Okay, this is what, this is an object. So here we are storing all the data that is getting returned from this vehicle. Okay, and what is this vehicle? This vehicle is basically the class name, right? This is the class name. So when we define a variable, right, this object is what? This is just a variable, right? This is just a variable. So when we define a variable, it has a type. What is the type of the variable? Int, float, right? So just like that, this vehicle is the type of the variable. So this vehicle is the class name, okay, where we are storing this object, right? Now let's just talk about this new keyword. All right, this is the most important keyword, and from here your learnings for constructor actually starts. Okay, so if someone was writing vehicle, obj is equal to just vehicle, the difference between this statement, the statement number 2 and statement number 1, what is the difference between this statement? The difference is it doesn't have that new keyword, and it means that if new keyword is not present, it is simply just a function which is getting called, and the value of this function is getting stored in obj object, which is just now we have understood. But as soon as we have this keyword new, this keyword says that okay, now this is not an ordinary function, this is a constructor. Okay, so this new keyword represents that you are not calling an ordinary function, you are calling a constructor. So whenever this new keyword comes anywhere in Java, it means you are calling a constructor. Okay, so this is where your learning for constructor starts. So if someone asks you how do you call an actually constructor, with the help of new keyword, if you don't use this new keyword, it means you are just calling a function. All right, I hope you have understood till here. This was just in start. I want you to go a little bit deep on this, okay, and understand all of this point written over here. So to understand all of this point, let's take a new example, okay. Now let's create our actual class called vehicle. All right, let's change the color, probably pink. Okay, now we will create a class. Let's create a class vehicle. Okay, now this is a class vehicle, and now what are the rules of constructor? It says it has the same name as the class. Okay, so let's define a constructor for this class. It means I have to define a function called as vehicle, as simple as that, and the function starts here, the function ends here. So the constructor is always defined inside a class, and the constructor will have a same name as the class. And you must have noticed I haven't written any return type like void, int. I haven't mentioned any return type. What does it signify? It signify that, sir, this is a constructor. Okay, if you find a function with the same name as the class and it does not have a return type, it means that it is a constructor. Okay, cool. Now let's try to understand and dig deep, little bit deep, and let's try to understand that why it does not have a return type. Okay, cool. So to understand why it does not have a return type, let's just do one thing. Let's just call this constructor. So you must have understood by now that how do you call a constructor? To call a constructor, you need to have a vehicle, obj, the object, which is equal to new keyword, new, and then vehicle. Okay, now this is how you call a constructor. Now just hold on for a second and just analyze what I have just written. I have just written that I am calling a function called vehicle, and whatever is getting returned from this vehicle, it is getting stored in this obj variable. And what is the type of the obj variable? The type of the obj variable is vehicle. It means this function is returning a value of type vehicle. So what Java does, Java will automatically add a return type of vehicle. Okay, so you don't need to add a return type on your own. You don't need to add int, you don't need to add float, or you don't need to add even vehicle. Java will add this automatically. All right, and now this is a constructor, because you can have more functions here as well. You can have more functions in this class. Probably I can have one more function called as vehicle. Okay, so what is the name of the function? The name of the function is vehicle. And what is the return type of the function? The return type of the function is vehicle. This is a valid statement, this is a valid function, but this is not a constructor. I will tell you, this is not a constructor. Why this is not a constructor? Because you have already added a return type. If you add a return type, it means it's a custom function which you are defining. If you don't add a return type, okay, the Java will add that return type automatically, and that will behave as a constructor. All right. So just to differentiate, now let's answer all of the questions. Okay, now let's just answer all the questions which were here. So what were the questions? All right, what were the questions? The questions were, the constructor has same name as the class. So why the constructor will have a same name as a class? Because just to identify that this is a constructor for a uniqueness, because inside a class you can define any number of method, you can define any method whatever you want, but how do you identify that method is a constructor or not? So the rule says it has the same name as the class. Okay, what is the second number rule? This was my rule number 1. What is my rule number 2? The rule number 2 says the constructor should not have a return type, not even void. Alright, so you must have understood why the constructor does not have a return type, because the Java add it automatically, and if you add a return type on your own, it means you are creating a custom method. Okay, and that is no more a constructor. Okay, cool. And are called automatically when an object is created using new. So this new keyword is very important. So when a constructor is called, whenever you have a new keyword. Okay, you can just call a method by just defining like vehicle like this, but this doesn't mean that you are calling the constructor. When you add this new keyword here, it means you are calling a constructor. So this was the overall idea of how constructor works. Alright, now let's dive a little bit more. Okay, I have some more questions. Now you can ask me. There are certain questions for interview like why does the constructor is not defined as abstract, why constructor is not defined as final, why constructor cannot be static. Because if you see this function, I can define this function as static. It doesn't matter. I can define this function as static, or I can define this function as final. Okay, or I can define this function as abstract as well, and this becomes a very important interview question also, that why the constructor cannot be static, final or abstract. But to answer this we have to wait a little bit more. Before that we need to understand that what are the types of constructor and how are constructors typically used in industry. Alright, cool. So the first is a default constructor. So what does default constructor says? Let's try to understand that. Let's try to understand first default constructor. Okay, cool. So to understand default constructor, what we will do, we will take our previous example of vehicle. Okay, so we have a class vehicle. Okay, sorry, not this, I have to remove this one. Alright, we have a class vehicle, and inside this vehicle we can have certain functions. Okay, and we can have certain variables also, the data variables also. Like what can be the data variables of this vehicle? It can be int tires, that how many tires are there in the vehicle. This is a variable of this class. We can have more, probably string. Color, what is the color of the vehicle? Okay, red, green, blue. So if the vehicle is a car, it will have 4 tires. If the vehicle is a truck, it will have 6 or 8 or 12 or 18 tires depending on how big the truck is. So these are the two variables which I am defining right now. Okay, and now next what we have, we define a constructor. Okay, let's define a constructor. So to define a constructor, I just have to write the vehicle, no return type. Okay, and just a function. Alright, so now we have defined a constructor. So to understand this constructor, do one thing. If someone call this vehicle, how do I call this vehicle? To call this vehicle, what will I do? I will write vehicle, let's say a car. A car is a vehicle, which is equal to new vehicle. Alright, cool. So right now, one thing you must have noticed, that over here I am not passing any parameter. No parameter. When I am not passing any parameter, what is happening actually? So a constructor is called as soon as this new keyword we have written. So when the constructor is called, this int tire, this was initially, what is the default value of int? The default value of int is 0. So initially what was the tire, the value of tire? 0. And initially what is the default value of a string? The default value of a string is null. So initially, if I don't initialize this variable, right now I am not initializing this variable, it means the default value is what it has taken. So tire will have 0 value and color will have 0 value. So if you do car dot get tires, if you do car dot get tires, what value will you get? What value will you get? You will get 0. And if you do car dot get color, what value will you get? You will get null. But do you think it is making any sense? It is not making any sense, because the value of tires of a car cannot be 0 and the value of color of a car cannot be 0, right? So whenever I want, so imagine a situation, you want to design a car, or you want to design a truck, or you want to design anything, and based on that you want to add how many tires you want, how many color, what is the color of that vehicle you want. All right, so if you don't initialize, it was initially 0 and null. But now the case is I want to define the tire, number of tires and number of color, and what is the color also. So to do that, what will I do? I will just probably define one more constructor. I'll probably define one more constructor, and the constructor will be vehicle, okay, int tire, comma, string color. Now you see what I am doing. Okay, here I am doing two things. The first thing is I have defined my constructor number 1. This is my constructor number 1 and this is my constructor number 2. And what is constructor number 1? Constructor number 1 has no parameters. It has no parameters. And what is constructor number 2? Constructor number 2 has 2 parameters. Okay, and it is legal to define 2 constructors in a class, one with no parameter and one having parameter. And even you can also differentiate with the number of parameters do you have. So probably I can have one more constructor. Okay, I can have one more constructor, vehicle. Let's not talk about one more constructor right now because it will be a little bit confusing. I will talk about this once we understand this parameterized constructor. Okay, let's stick to the point, let's not deviate. So what was the problem statement? The problem statement was that if I do car.get tires, it is coming 0, and if I do car.get color, it is coming null. But now when I define an object for a truck probably, so now let's define a new object for a truck which says vehicle truck. Truck is my new object, which is equal to new vehicle. But now inside the parameter I will pass the number of tires. So I will pass 4 and I will also pass the color. So let's pass it as red. Okay, so now what I'm doing, I'm defining a truck which has a 4, not 4, truck doesn't have a 4 tires, so let's define it as 8, which makes a little bit of sense. So I am defining a vehicle called truck which has 8 tires and the color of the truck is red. So what has just happened right now, this was the class, what is class called as? Class is basically a blueprint. If you know, class is just a blueprint. So with the help of this blueprint, I have created two objects. What was my first object? The first object was car. And what was my second object? The second object is truck. And these two objects are based on this blueprint only, but the properties, the behavior of this object is different. The behavior of car is different, the behavior of truck is different, but the properties, the variables are same, the number of tires and the color is same. So just like that, what flexibility it give us? Now it gives us the flexibility that I can define any number of vehicles. I can define ship, I can define aeroplane, I can define bus, I can define a motorcycle. Whatever you want, you can define it right now. What you need to change? You just need to change the number of tires and you just need to change the number of colors. Basically the color. So are you understanding in real life what problem it is solving? It is solving the problem of having multiple objects. Okay, I can just have a single class, and from this class I can have multiple objects, and I can create multiple properties based on that. So if I come back, what was my default constructor? A constructor which does not have any parameters. If no constructor is defined, Java provides with one automatically. This is a very important question interviewer always asked. So if no constructor is defined, Java will automatically provide one constructor. So for example, I had the class vehicle. Okay, I had the class vehicle, and I do not define any constructor inside this. Now even if you do vehicle car is equal to new vehicle, this will still work because the Java will define a constructor automatically. And I'm not lying, I'm going to show you this in code. So after we complete the theory, I'm going to show you the coding part as well, where I'm going to show you live that I will not define any constructor and still Java will have added one new constructor. And obviously Java will not add parameterized constructor, right, on its own, because it does not know that what parameters do you want. It will just add a default constructor which does not have any parameter. And let me tell you one more thing, a very important thing. If you define a constructor with parameter inside this, so let's define a constructor vehicle with parameter int tires and string color. Now Java will not add any default constructor. In this case, the Java will not add any default constructor. Very important. No default constructor. Why? Because you have already defined a custom constructor on your own which has certain parameter. In this case, Java will not define any constructor. Java will only define a constructor if you have not defined any constructor, right? So what is parameterized constructor? It is used when we want to pass value at an object creation. And what does it do? It provides flexibility. Just now we have understood it has provided great flexibility that I can define any number of vehicles I want. This is the flexibility Java gives us using constructors. Alright, cool. So we have understood this part as well. Let's move ahead and let's understand more about it. Okay, key facts and rule. This is the most important slide of this particular video. This rules you should not miss. Okay, if you miss this, trust me, you will face difficulty in your coding journey. The first point first point says the constructor name equal to class name. This we have already understood, so let me tick mark it. Second point, the second point says the constructor cannot be abstract, static or synchronized, or it cannot be final as well. Everything is legal. Okay, we have added final, no worries. Cool. So we will understand this. Let's try to understand point number 2 in detail. This is the very important point, very important. So I don't have an empty page. Let me add an empty page over here. Okay, cool. Now let's try to understand why the constructor cannot be final cannot be static, cannot be abstract. These things let's try to understand one by one. First, we will talk about final. Okay. So when we talk about final, we have to know what does final keyword actually means. Final keyword actually means the method or the variable cannot be overridden. So if I define any method as final, or if I define any variable as final, it means that variable is now final and no one can change the value of that variable. It means that method is now final and no one can change the value of that method or the implementation of that method. Alright. This is why we define final. Now we will understand why constructor cannot be final. So we will go back to our previous classic example of class vehicle. Okay, and we have a constructor inside this class vehicle. Alright, cool. Now imagine a scenario that we have one more class Audi, okay, which basically inherit the class vehicle. So now we are talking about inheritance. Okay, we are talking about inheritance. So you all know that when we say inherit, when the inheritance is coming into play, all the methods and variables are inherited by the subclass, right? All the methods and variables are inherited by the subclass. And one important thing you need to know, that constructors are not inherited. Very important. It will help you in programming as well as in your interview. Very, very important that constructors are never inherited. You have to know this. Now, let's try to understand why constructors are not inherited and why it cannot be final. Cool. So, to understand why constructors are not inherited, let's imagine the constructor is getting inherited. Okay, so we will assume that constructor is getting inherited and we will see if the constructor gets inherited, what actually happens. So let's imagine the constructor got inherited. So it means the vehicle function came here also, which is not the case. It will not be possible in real life. We are just taking this as an example to understand what problems can happen if the constructor get inherited. Okay, so first of all, the first problem which you can see over here, if this constructor get inherited, the first problem that you will face is, what is the class name? The class name is Audi. So what will be the name of the constructor of this class? The name of the constructor of this class will again be Audi, right? Do you think the name of the constructor of this class will be vehicle? No. Now this is not a constructor anymore. This is not a constructor. Okay. The rule is, if we define the constructor name should be same as class name. So obviously this is not a constructor. But now what is this function? This function doesn't really make any sense, right? Does it making any sense? Because it does not even have a return type. It does not have a return type and it is not even a constructor. So Java will not add a return type also, because Java only add return type to a constructor. So for this, to avoid this confusion, Java has told that okay, we will not inherit the constructor. Okay, cool. And if we do not inherit the constructor, do you think defining the constructor as final does really make sense? because final means the function cannot be overridden, right? And if the function cannot be overridden, if the function cannot be inherited also, it means the function cannot be overridden, because to override the function has to be inherited, because overriding can be done only by another class, right? If the function cannot be if the function cannot be inherited, then there is no sense of defining it as final, because even if we don't define it as final, it is already final, it's not getting inherited, so implementation of this will never be changed. So this is why it's not final. Second point, let's try to understand abstract. Why this is not abstract, why the constructor cannot be abstract. And it's very simple. Okay, let me add one more page. 2-3 page I can add probably. Okay. Where are the other pages? Are they lost? Never mind. So we were talking that our constructors cannot be abstract. So if we see our example why the constructor cannot be abstract, if we see abstract class means it has to be implemented, because if we define a constructor like this, abstract vehicle, okay, abstract vehicle, and we don't give the implementation, and I want to give the implementation in a different class, because abstraction means that you cannot implement it, the implementation will be done by different class. So since this constructor cannot be inherited, right, who will give the implementation? So for that the constructor cannot be abstract, as it cannot be implemented by another class, it cannot be inherited. That's why you have to give the implementation then and there only. You cannot rely on some other class to have the implementation, right? So this is why it is. So we have discussed final, we have discussed abstract, and we need to discuss one more thing, that is static. So static is very simple. So if you have this class called vehicle, okay, and there is one rule you must know, that a static function can only access static variables. Okay, so if this is my vehicle function, the constructor, and if I define this function as a static, it means it can access only static variable. So what if I have that variable of tires and variable of color, and if I want to set the value of this, and these are not static, so do you think this constructor will be able to set the value of this tire and color? No, because if the constructor is static, one second, if the function is static, it can only access static variables, it cannot access tire and color, and this is the reason the constructor cannot be static, right? Okay, let's move ahead. We have discussed, so we discussed point number 1, we discussed point number 2. A class can have multiple constructor overloading, we have already discussed this, constructor overloading, a parameterized constructor, and multiple constructor. We have already discussed constructor cannot be inherited, but a subclass can call the parent constructor using super. So super is just a keyword to call the constructor of parent class. You cannot just inherit it, you can just call, as simple as that. Okay, if any constructor is defined, compiler does not provide the default constructor. We have already discussed this, that if you already define a constructor, then no other constructor can be defined. But the default constructor will not be there. Constructor chaining is also possible within same class or within parent class also. So I can show you this constructor chaining as well. But before that, we have to see the common interview questions. Okay, these are the important part which you need to know, and this will literally make your interview go wild. So the first question: can a constructor be final, static, or abstract? And give me the reason. So we have understood a constructor cannot be final, static, or abstract because final constructor are not inherited and no sense of final. So as I told you that if the constructor are not getting inherited, it means no one will override. So it means that it doesn't make sense in defining it as final. Constructor is tied to object, not class. That's why it's static. Abstract constructor cannot be overridden. The same reason. Okay. Question number 2. What happens if you define only parameterized constructor and no default constructor? So compiler does not provide a default constructor in this case, and calling new class name with argument will cause an compilation error. This is an important part you have to know. What type of error you will face? You will face a compilation error. Can a constructor call another constructor? Yes, using this or super. This we will see. Can we call a constructor explicitly? No, you cannot directly call a constructor like a method, because to call a constructor you need a new keyword, or if you are calling from a parent or subclass you need a this or super keyword. Okay. Does constructor return any value? Yes, it returns a value, because if we have seen the vehicle class, you have seen it returns a value of vehicle, but it is not, it is not explicitly returning. So when you say it does not return explicitly but internally returns the reference of the newly created object, right? So this is what it means actually. Can interfaces have constructor? No, interfaces cannot have constructor. Because why it cannot have constructor? Because it cannot be instantiated. Because in interfaces you do not implement the function, and if you do not implement the function, the constructor is not implemented. And if constructor is not implemented, then someone has to implement it, and if someone has to implement it, someone has to inherit it. If the constructor cannot be inherited, so no one can implement it. As simple as that. So everything revolves around implementation and inheritance. If it's literally all. Why can't constructors be inherited? Because the subclass has its own identity and need its own initialization logic. We have already seen this. Difference between default and no argument constructor. This also we have seen. Default constructor is provided by compiler. If no constructor is defined, no argument constructor is explicitly written by the programmer. Alright. So this is all about constructor. I want you to show a little bit in code as well that how constructor actually works. Okay. So let's come here. Okay. Let's see a little bit of constructors in code so that it will help you to understand a little bit better. Okay. So to define, how do I define a constructor? To define a constructor, we will first need a class. So first let's define our class vehicle. Okay. So this is our class vehicle. To define a constructor over here, what I will do, I will just say vehicle and like this, and boom, that's it. This is our constructor. Our constructor is already defined. If we want to call this function, call this constructor, how do we call this function? I come here, I write vehicle Audi equal to new vehicle. Alright, cool. Now one thing I want to show you over here. Right now if I'm writing vehicle Audi equal to new vehicle, there is no error. Alright, but let's change one thing. Here I will add my parameters int tires and string color. So here now you see there is one related problem, and now if you come here you will see it is asking me to define, change the signature or create the constructor. Now are you understanding? So basically if I remove this, let's comment this out. If I remove this and if I come here, there is no error and I am still able to call my constructor. Why? Even if I don't have any constructor written, I am still able to call the constructor because the Java is giving me a default constructor. But as soon as I uncomment this, now I am not allowed to do this. Why? Because now Java is not giving me a default constructor. This is what we have learned. So now I have to pass the number of tires and the color. So the number of tires is 4 and the color is probably red in strings, right? So this is how actually constructor works. So now, alright, you need to first define this variable also. So you need to define int tires. We just forgot tires. And you need to define string color. Okay. And with taking this input, you can set it also. I want to set this tire. So to set this tire, what will I do? I will write this dot tire is equal to tires, right? This is giving me an error. Let's see. Create field tire in vehicle. Okay, this is not tire, it's tires. All right. And I will write this dot color is equal to color. So I want to explain you one simple thing in here, that when I use this keyword this basically represents the class. Okay. So when I write this dot tire, because I have two tires over here, one tire is here and one tire is here. So when I'm writing this dot tire, this is referring to this tire, and when I'm not writing this keyword, it is referring to this tire. Okay, so basically this means class dot tire. So what I'm doing, I'm this dot tires equal to, I'm setting this tire as this tires. Okay, and this dot color, it means I'm setting this color as this color. So this is what exactly the logic for this keyword. All right, so cool. So I believe I have explained you a lot in this video. I think I'll just take a pause for now and probably come again with a new video with a new topic. So I think that's all for this video. If you have any doubt, you can just come down to the comment section. I reply to every comment, and one small request, if you have disliked the video, you can just consider subscribing. If you have come this far, I want you to comment that you have watched till last, so that it gives me a motivation also. At least someone is learning and staying in the video till last. So yeah, that's all. I believe I will see you in the next video. Until then, bye bye. Take care.